Hi everyone. I'm here today with what might end up being a little short bonus review beyond my regular weekly review. I'm not sure how I'm going to release this yet, because I recently finished book 2 in George R.R. Martin's series A Song of Ice and Fire, which is called A Clash of Kings. I haven't seen the Game of Thrones TV series and am actually not generally a big reader of high fantasy books, but I became more interested in them last year after learning a bit about the processes writers use to craft a coherent and interesting world, an exciting plot, and maybe most importantly, to create characters with high stakes. I'll link some of the channels that I've been watching on those topics below because they're really interesting. Anyway, I checked out the audiobook for A Game of Thrones, which is book 1 in the series, because this is by now a super well-known series and is often used for examples of plot writing and character development, much in the same way that A Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or Harry Potter are. So I figured if anywhere is a good place to start on fantasy, this wouldn't be a bad one. I have also read those other books and watched those movies as well. Now, I know there are more than enough Game of Thrones reviews and commentaries out there by now, which is why I'm going to keep this short and at a high level, just giving my general impressions. There also will be no spoilers, although you've probably had it spoiled for you already if you're actually interested, except that I will be mentioning particular characters, so you'll know if I mention them in Book 2 that they're still alive in Book 2, though I won't be specifically referring to the death of any characters. I enjoyed Book 1, entitled A Game of Thrones. The world within the book is built so richly with so many different territories and houses, each of which has a complicated relationship with all the other lords of the other houses, not to mention their own personal conflicts between characters even within the same houses, which makes this feel very realistic and reflective of one of the sort of medieval societies in our own world, with a touch of fantasy. Although I'm no expert on medieval history, so it'd be hard for me to say how it differs and how it's similar. The writing in this book is interesting and captivating, and the characters, especially at their best moments, feel like real people that go beyond the mold of our typical heroes and villains, making it often hard to determine whether there really are good guys in the novel at all. And they all have interesting personal stories and motivations, and flaws that very often will lead to their own demise. Where I thought Book 1 went a bit wrong, though, was that while it does an excellent job of portraying the intricate world in which the characters live, both geographically and politically, and while it introduces a handful of really interesting characters, the book jumps from character to character in a way that often feels disjointed because many of these stories are frankly quite unrelated to one another in any immediate sense for the entire book. It can be jarring to be reading at one point about Ned Stark, who finds himself entangled in this complicated plot to usurp the king's power, and who's arguably the one that the main story in this book revolves around. And then suddenly to be whisked off to an entirely different continent from the rest of the characters' stories to read about Daenerys Targaryen, who has an interesting story and probably becomes an important character at some point in the series, but who bears almost no relation at present to what's going on in the main thread. And sometimes in the audiobook, it'll be like 5 or more hours before we hear from the same character again, which can really make us lose any suspense there was in that character's plot line by the time we finally return to him or her, unless we're actively learning about this character from other characters. At times it left me wondering whether the parts about Daenerys Targaryen in particular would have been better off just put in their own standalone section, out of chronological order, as is done in the second and I think some of the third Lord of the Rings books, to keep the readers from this jarring effect of bouncing back and forth between storylines that are each interesting in their own right. Another slight issue I had with Book 1 is that the overall pacing is a little bit off. If you've read this book, you'll probably know what I mean when I say that the most important action seems to have already occurred about 2/3 of the way through the novel, and the result is that the rest of the book is a bit of a slog because it just feels kind of like cleanup. But not even that, because there's important stuff going on, but important to the overall 7-book series and not to the main action of this novel. In fact, while this first book does an excellent job of setting the scene for power struggles to come in the future novels, it's hard to peg out a main story in this novel with a beginning, middle, and end. Thus, in many ways, it feels like this entire book is one big 30-hour prologue for the rest of the series. For these reasons, though, I think Book 2, A Clash of Kings, worked a lot better for me, and thus I enjoyed it a lot more as one coherent story. Right from the beginning, there are 3 self-proclaimed kings and a few other powerful lords, all jockeying for power, each of whom has flaws that make the reader question whether they'd be a good leader. We pretty much understand and are promised by the novel's very title that these kings are going to clash with one another, and that presumably they're going to be winners and losers by the end. And following the separate stories of these wannabe kings as they approach and converge on a final battle for the realm was really fun for me. Sure, there are plenty of open plot threads at the end of the novel, and the story is far from finished, as it should be, given that there are still 5 other novels to come, but there are clear stakes in this novel in a global sense, and by the end of the novel, but not by 2/3 of the way into the novel. There are clear winners and losers. And it's clear what remaining issues will be at play in Book 3, but for the most part, each character's chapter of their story feels fulfilled. We still end up following Daenerys Targaryen through the distant land of who knows where in a story that seems like it bears no relation to the rest of the novel and that made me sigh every time one of her chapters came up, but it feels like we're maybe getting closer to a point where she will interact with the rest of the world. Other than her, though, the characters feel less disjointed because they're all observing this central story from their own vantage points. And thus, even if we haven't had a point of view from a character for a while, we often learn about them or learn about a common central story through other characters and narratives, which makes it feel less frustrating to have gaps of 5 or more hours where a character just seems to have gone silent in the narrative. There are still a few different parts to the story. For the most part, you could split the characters into the ones involved in the battle for the North and those involved in the battle for the Ultimate Throne in the South, although these two struggles are deeply intertwined, and we still keep learning of one through the characters in the other. There was one other character, Jon Snow, who I found rather boring in this novel, although his path in itself is interesting, and I found it had a very satisfying ending that hints at more to come in later books. His trek through the far northern regions of Westeros feels almost completely detached from the action of the rest of the novel. In his case, this is partly by design, since the Night's Watch are, in fact, an isolated and detached group of men, but this still makes his parts of the story feel kind of like interludes on the side. All in all, though, I was happily surprised by A Clash of Kings, and it left me excited to take on Book 3. And that's about all I have to say for this short Game of Thrones review of Books 1 and 2. Thanks for watching. Until next time, bye, and happy reading.